For me, these differences, whether you like to have sex at that fraternity party on a couch, for instance, or whether you like to have sex while cohabitating in the suburbs, whether your sex with women looks like one culture or another, for instance, should be at the forefront of our thinking about sexuality. And these differences that I just named around bisexuality should be at the forefront of our thinking about what is bisexuality. But because early bi movement literature placed so much emphasis on proving the legitimacy of bisexuality, instead our attention is always at risk of being directed back to legitimizing information, namely evidence of the congenital bisexual, this person who was born bisexual, and we want to turn to the body to make sense of this. Now, the science of bisexuality, just like the science of homosexuality, or the science of gender and race for that matter, is something we should be concerned about. Because when we look very closely at it, we see that it is producing data that simply mirrors what people already believe about gender and sexuality. That it's producing data that simply reproduces the most crass and anti-queer understandings of gender and sexuality. Namely that women are more sexually fluid than men. Bullshit. And therefore women are more likely to be true bisexuals, and we see this current even in work by queer psychologists like Lisa Diamond, or that bisexual men are really gay because their arousal patterns are indistinguishable from gay men's, such as in the 2005 study conducted at Northwestern. A second and related limitation of early bisexual theorizing, and this one may be a little more controversial, is that in charging lesbians and gay men with having an irrational fear of bisexuality, these articulations of bi-identity overlooked some very important socioeconomic and political conditions that shape our experiences of sexuality. Currently, I'm teaching a course at UCR called Love, Desire, and Lesbian Sexuality. And each quarter, I listen as lesbian and bi women students have the familiar argument about bi privilege versus biphobia. The lesbian students announce that they will not date bisexual women for fear of competing with men, and bi women respond that their desire for men has nothing to do with their level of commitment to the women that they date. Bi students cap off their argument with an appeal to basic fairness. All sexual orientations have a right to exist, a right to respect, and freedom from this kind of discrimination. Generally, bi students seem to win, to the extent that anyone wins, they seem to win this debate, as everyone ultimately decides that fairness wins the day and fear is not a reasonable position from which to act. Now, usually I let this debate play out without intervention, but in truth, I'm longing for a deeper discussion about why this debate persists and what it tells us about how lesbians continue to experience the world, namely how they experience women's attraction to male power and privilege. Lesbians as a group are not crazy. Some of them are crazy. As a group, they are not crazy. They are expressing a fear that may be misdirected, but nonetheless a fear that mirrors their sense of vulnerability in a heteronormative sexual economy. Unfortunately, for bi women, the fact that bi women are often feminists and are as deeply committed to their relationships with women as any lesbian would be simply does not negate the ways that lesbians are positioned vis-a-vis the economy of sex, gender, and power. In other words, what I want to say to my students is, it's a wonderful thing to be a bisexual woman, and sexism means that bisexual women do hurt lesbians without intending to. And it's just another way that sexism sucks for all of us. So to suggest, as early bi activists did, that we shouldn't even speak about the ways that bisexual women were hurting lesbians or that bisexual men were hurting gay men, I think is yet another way of redirecting our attention away from the social conditions that give form to sexual subjectivities. Clearly, our sexual desires do not exist in a socioeconomic vacuum. For instance, the imperative to marry and to be monogamous means that many women who identify as bi or queer are married, and many of them are married to men. I have currently 4 such women friends who are bi-identified and married to men. And the question of how to honor, or at least sustain, their desire for women and their engagement in queer subculture is like a profound and relentless struggle in their relationships. Another of these women is, or one of these women is non-monogamous in her marriage to a man, but just finding the time to have sex with women, given that she has kids, is like beyond what she can even figure out how to do. And so my point here is that I think we would do well to focus less on the brain chemistry, for instance, that ostensibly causes bisexual desire, and more on these really deep and profound structural conditions that are shaping bisexual desire, making it possible or impossible, that are giving form to its experience. Okay, the last limitation that I'm going to speak about very briefly before I move on to the good news of this talk is the way that early bi theorizing directed much of its education at lesbian and gay people, thereby missing an opportunity to re-theorize sexual and gender fluidity at a broader level in a way that would have implications for everyone and that could become the basis of a new theory of gender and desire. The bi movement, unlike the queer movement that would come on its heels, did not tell us much about how bi people resisted sexual norms. Did they do gender differently? Did their gender fluid desires mean something about their gender politics, their feminist politics? Did they have sex in non-normative ways? In other words, was bisexuality a technical description like homosexuality, or was it a movement? I recall exploring these sorts of questions with an advisor of mine in graduate school. She had been in a long-term relationship with a man, and she also shared with me that she had long been attracted to women. But when I asked her if she identified as bisexual, she said no, and I asked her why, and she said because the term felt almost medical, like homosexual, and she could find no bisexual movement. It didn't feel political to her, therefore she wasn't so interested in taking it up. So this begs the question, what did happen to the bisexual movement? And I think the answer is twofold. First, as I have outlined, the most vocal proponents of the movement focused their energies on adding bisexuality to the set of available and legitimate sexual orientations. Instead of proudly claiming the queerest and most threatening elements of bisexual desire, that it is neither here nor there, that it is the persistent potential for something else that could be lurking below, that it can travel through heteronormative worlds in disguise, and most alarmingly, that it is a desire that can be unhinged from the gender binary. This is what's so threatening about bisexuality. But instead of making these challenges the centerpiece of the movement, much bisexual activist literature in this period sidesteps it or even denies the possibility of these things, all in the name of legitimizing bisexuality. And this made it particularly susceptible, I think, it made the bisexual movement particularly susceptible to being subsumed within a mainstream gay and lesbian movement that had already taken a very assimilationist approach. What I wish that we had seen, and what I see brewing now in some very exciting ways, is a reframing of bisexuality as genderqueer desire. Of course, we now have a genderqueer movement, but this movement is typically anchored in self-identification, as in, I am genderqueer. But what language do we have for naming the desire for genderqueerness, or for the person whose love and desire go beyond constructions of male and female? This desire for is the companion to genderqueer selfhood. I think this is what it truly means to to love beyond gender. To articulate that you are beyond gender must involve having a critique of the gender binary, to imagine a world without gender, or a gender-fucked world that combines elements of both genders. It's not a world in which we say both women and men. A second factor in the depoliticization of bisexuality is that those bisexual activists in the 80s who did have a queerer agenda ended up, not surprisingly, at the center of the queer movement that took off in the early 90s. And though the queer movement discourse differed considerably from the bisexual identity movement a decade prior, I think there's significant evidence to suggest that bisexual activists were really at the helm of the queer movement. So how do genderqueer politics challenge conventional understandings of bisexuality? And what does this mean for the bi movement today? First, queer, as articulated by queer scholars and activists, is not a sexual orientation. It is a mode of political critique. It is a critique of all things oppressively normal, especially conventional ideas about gender and sexuality. Queer is not about being a respectable, average, gay, lesbian, or bisexual citizen who lives just like his or her heterosexual counterparts. Instead, it is about resisting the cultural and institutional forces that attempt to make all people conform to normal or straight ways of life, such as settling down, getting married, having children, getting an SUV, getting all private with all of your stuff that you're going to buy in your new house, and aspiring to be just like everybody else. Transgender and genderqueer movements take queer critique and apply it more directly to thinking about gender. And this, I think, is having some profound effects for a new generation of young queer people who might previously have identified as bisexual, but now opt for queer or genderqueer frameworks. A centerpiece of transgender theorizing has been the concept of the gender binary. And the gender binary refers to the idea that humans exist in two essential biologically determined forms, male and female. I probably do not need to convince you that the gender binary is central to the way many cultures are organized, and in the United States, it is certainly central to the way that we think about sexual orientation. A genderqueer approach to sexuality not only challenges heteronormative assumptions, but it also, and more importantly, questions the ways in which gay, lesbian, and bisexual models of sexuality reinforce the gender binary. Heterosexuality, homosexuality, and bisexuality are all models of desire that are determined by the sex or genitals of the participants, the people involved. So heterosexuality, when you say I'm heterosexual, you're saying I am a man who desires women, or I am a woman who desires men. When you're lesbian, you're announcing your I am a woman who desires women. When you say I'm a gay man, you're announcing I am a man who desires men. And when you say you're bisexual, you're saying I'm a woman who desires men and women, or I'm a man who desires men and women.